Hello everyone, you are watching OBN Horn of Africa, the newly launched channel of Oromia Broadcasting Network. This channel is designated aiming at strengthening unity, solidarity, fraternity, and regional integration of Horn of Africa nation. This channel broadcasts in different languages, in Amharic, Arabic, Kiswahili, Somali, Hadiya, and English language. Talk to OBN is one of the English language program. This program brings you successful people such as researchers, politicians, scholars, celebrities, businessmen, and they will tell you their experience and give expertise when it's needed. Thank you for watching. My guest today is Dr. Konstantinos Brutesva, a senior United Nations policy advisor. Doctor, welcome to Talk to OBN show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
All right, I'm really thrilled to have you here.
Thank you.
We are here to talk about the impact of COVID-19, the economic impact particularly in Ethiopia, in Africa, and in the world as well. What are the socio-economic impact of COVID-19 throughout the globe and Africa as well as Ethiopia as well?
Well, it is throughout the globe now. We have almost 4 million people infected with the virus, and tens of thousands have died. The impact on the bigger OECD countries, the industrialized nations, is that the economies have been hurt very, very seriously. Over $9 trillion have been wiped out of the market now globally. And if we look into countries like Italy, Spain, the United States, Britain, they all have lost human lives, and of course the economic recovery will take a long time. When it comes to Africa, it's going to be a bit more serious in terms of its economic impact. Countries that have been exporting oil and minerals cannot export it anymore because most of the industrialized nations, including China, have stopped production. So for this reason, we have most of, especially the oil producing regions in Ethiopia, in Africa, to be losing their income. If we take Angola, for example, it's gone literally negative. It has impact in countries like Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria, which are exporting oil. Even Senegal, which has started just pumping oil this year, cannot even pay its debt of $4 billion, which was put into the investment. So the problems we have in Africa is also compounded by what is going to happen in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, the major impact of the virus will be one, most of the countries that provide foreign direct investment will try to keep the money now in their own countries for their own stimulus to recover the economy. The second thing is a large part of our diaspora, which is sending a lot of money to Ethiopia. This could be part of the victims of the unemployment in their own countries, and therefore this might reduce tremendously. The third arena is that since global trade is in very, very serious difficulty, especially exports like the flour market, for example, the cut flours that were exported to Europe have been affected by it. So this affects most of the outputs of Africa in terms of agricultural products, horticultural products, and therefore it's very important for Africa to look into other alternative means of getting resources. In Ethiopia, the other problem we have is the tourism sector will be hit in a very difficult way. For example, Ethiopian Airlines' contribution to the Ethiopian economy is about $4 billion a year. Now that's gone, and Ethiopian Airlines now is losing about $550 million so far. So these areas, now when you see Ethiopian Airlines, you link this to the hospitality business, the hotels, the travel agencies, the taxis, all of them will be affected by this. So the other area is the major part of our tourism are conferences related to the African Union and to the Economic Commission for Africa here, since both have their office here. So now with these conferences off, our hotels are literally empty. In fact, some of the hotels have started closing down completely, like Radisson, Hyatt Regency, Ramada. They all have closed down their doors for guests. So this will have a major impact on the employees. It will have a major impact on the income of the hotel itself. It will have a major impact on the taxes that these hotels were paying to the government. And also this cascades also small business like cafes, restaurants. All of them are now without incomes. And yet, according to the emergency regulations, these organizations have to keep paying salaries to their staff. They have to maintain a certain level of activity even without the kind of income they had before.
What is the expected economic recession that Ethiopia may face due to this outbreak?
Well, the Ethiopian economy had serious difficulties, and when Prime Minister Abiy came to power, the first thing he did is to revitalize the economy. And he has what you call the homegrown economic plan. And the homegrown economic plan has been designed. Several commissions and committees have been formed. And these committees and commissions have been working on liberalizing the economy, encouraging the private sector to have a major role in the Ethiopian economy, and also downsizing or right-sizing the government so that the expense of the government could be in line with its income. Ethiopia has done a tremendous work in the last decades, like the infrastructure built, roads, dams, power transmission areas, universities. It has achieved also what you call the Millennium Development Goals, which ended in 2015. And therefore, now the new government in Ethiopia is trying to build on these achievements, but to give some kind of macroeconomic balance that is urgently required. So that will be affected very much now with the funding that comes from FDI, foreign direct investment, the foreign currency we used to get from the diaspora. The export sector was not performing very well even before, so that has to be calibrated so that the export sector could increase. I know the industrial parks have been set up, but for these industrial parks to be able to produce and export is going to take some time. Some other experience of industrial parks, like for example in Uganda, have not been successful. But in Kenya, where they have over 100 industrial parks which are owned by private investors, these have been functioning very well, and the balance of payments of Kenya is always very positive. But if we see the Ethiopian case, now the economy has to look into the agro-industrial development area very, very seriously. We have tremendous amount of land, more than 72 million hectares of arable land. We only use about 15-16% according to the Ministry of Agriculture. Our rivers take 122 billion cubic meters of water out of Ethiopia every year. We have to do this. The government of Ethiopia has been trying to get investors to work on the what you call commercial farms, mechanized farms, but these have failed. So what are the ways and means of encouraging real investors that are going to produce? Because if we grow food in our country, much of our foreign currency could be saved. We import wheat, we import edible oil, we import sugar. Even if the sugar factories, 11 of them or 10 of them, were successful, we could have saved up to $300 million in our foreign exchange. It's the same thing with wheat. Now there are promising areas where the Prime Minister has been reporting on what you call the lowland wheat, which has been under an experiment by the Agricultural Research Institute and the Ministry of Agriculture. If that succeeds, this country can feed itself. Today we have a major problem because of the COVID-19, because the government is reporting over 30 million people will need food assistance or livelihood assistance, safety net assistance. So the government can challenge this and come out of this as a winner, but if the government has the right structure, strategy, policy, the processes, and of course the personnel within the government, like in the woredas, in the zones, in the regional administrations and at the federal level, who can ensure that the vision of the Prime Minister is translated into some kind of an action.
That's good. What is the impact of COVID-19 in tourism and travel industry in Ethiopia? Of course, you've mentioned some.
Yeah, tourism has been a rising star in Ethiopia. At one point, the contribution went even to some kind of $3.5 billion a year. When we look at tourism, we're not only looking at people who are coming here to see our, the historic route, but also Addis Ababa had become a center of conference where everybody used to descend to discuss regional issues, African issues, and of course global issues. I remember the CASA meeting for HIV/AIDS at one time attracted 11,000 people, just one conference. So we're losing that. The second area is tourism is not an area we have given a lot of focus for a long period of time, frankly, because much of the tourists now who've been coming to Africa were going on safari to see wild animals, South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, some degree Mozambique. But now tourists are changing their tunes towards historic artifacts. So Ethiopia has this historic route like Lalibela, Gondar, Aksum, the Sofamar caves in Bali. All these are a new area of attraction. The Omo Valley is one of the biggest attractions for tourist investment. But the problems we have is we don't have the tourism infrastructure in Ethiopia to be able to accommodate these tourists in terms of hotels, in terms of communications, road or flight communications. So these have been improving, but they have not improved to a point where they can be immensely successful. Because tourism is going to start again now. Most countries in the developed world have started opening up, and therefore it's very important that we look into this as a major income source, like we're building the industrial parks, like building the power stations and power transmission lines. We have to look onto tourism infrastructure very, very seriously. But because of this COVID, we're going to see a substantial decrease, in fact, going down to zero. Ethiopian Airlines, as I stated earlier, is itself having problems. So all this cascading business that Ethiopian Airlines brings, including tourism, will be going down. And therefore, this must be matched by some other arenas of development.
To what extent will the outbreak of COVID-19 affect foreign aid?
Well, foreign aid, it's interesting you ask that question, because when you talk about foreign aid, we might even do better than what we were getting before. Sure. Foreign aid is linked to so many conditionalities. I remember during the electoral crisis we had in 2005, much of the foreign aid the donors that were giving to Ethiopia was going to stop. But eventually what they did is they created what you call this protection of basic services, where the funds would go directly to the woredas. So now, when you look at the kind of foreign aid we're getting, we have substantial amount of funds coming from the OECD, the developed nations. The Gulf states also have been trying to support Prime Minister Abiy's government. But now, because of COVID-19, there is a pool of international resources available as aid to Africa, Latin America, and some Asian countries. So if you look, the G20 countries have promised to put $5 trillion. And in fact, Saudi Arabia has pumped 500 million already into that account. The IMF is putting about $1 trillion. World Bank probably similar amount of money. The European Union is putting $3.5 trillion into the pandemic. The American government is putting another $3 trillion. So Ethiopia might end up getting more money, one, to fight the pandemic, and two, to establish its health infrastructure to a point where such pandemics might not affect the economy and society again. So this is a wonderful opportunity for Ethiopia. One question is, in government, do we have people who can go and convince these international organizations to be able to deliver this kind of aid? Because it's going to be a competition. So, you know, you have countries like South Africa, which have a highly developed bureaucracy. Kenya, which has a highly developed bureaucracy. You know, in our country, the bureaucracy has been underdeveloped for many reasons, but we won't go into that. So you need people who can really convince international donors that Ethiopia, number one, is the second largest population in Africa after Nigeria. Number two, Ethiopia is a rising star in its economic development. The Financial Times has said very clearly that between 2010 and 2020, Ethiopia has been the fastest growing economy in the world, registering over 10% GDP growth. So we can explain this to them. Number three, Ethiopia is sitting in the middle of a very, very rough neighborhood. Somalia is not a stable government. South Sudan is not a stable government. Sudan is having its own crisis. The problems we had with Eritrea might be resolved now, but there are still lots of things that need to be done. And of course, we have the Gulf states where we have a major war in Yemen. So Ethiopia has to sustain its economic growth and its military martial capability to be able to respond to any crisis that would happen outside our borders. These are the things donors want to hear. Because at the end of the day, if you have a major crisis in any region, they don't want to send their own army and sacrifice their own people to be able to create peace. So people in the Security Council have to be convinced that Ethiopia's stability, economic, social, and political, is as important as the Horn of Africa's stability. And I think now with the initiative Prime Minister Abiy has taken to create peace with Eritrea and also with Somalia, these are very important initiatives that we need to bank on. But you know, one person in the government cannot do everything. You have to have a team that can articulate this very clearly to our donors and supporters. That's how you get foreign aid. We get a lot of foreign aid, but the per capita foreign aid, if you see, is one of the lowest in Africa when you divide the foreign aid by the number of the population. So far, I think we've been literally gambling as a country where we go to the West and the West supports us, and when there is a political crisis, we go to China, and then China says now things are over, we cannot go on loaning you funds. So Ethiopia at this point now has to pay almost $1.5 billion every year on the loans we've taken to build the infrastructure. So we might be mindful of these issues and find a team that can articulate this, because without aid, without loans from the international community, we cannot push forward. And the fundamental problem we have in our country is our financial system is not up to the market economy, and therefore we have to depend on aid eternally.
We've seen so many lockdowns overseas, especially the very developed nation have done that. We can mention America, Italy, Spain, and UK as well. But in African nation, like a very poorest nation, we can mention Ethiopia. So such promising jobs are undergoing these days. What will happen if a complete lockdown effected that lasts for 2 or 3 months in the economic sector? The impact of lockdown on the economy.
Well, you know, it's an interesting question again, because if we see some of the countries in Europe and the United States where lockdown had a negative effect on the economy, but you can see also countries that have managed the virus without such lockdowns. You can take Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, Norway, Germany. And incidentally, all these countries are led by women. Their prime ministers are women. They've been very successful. They had very low death rates. They have very low infection rates. But they didn't lock down the economy. I think the main problem with the virus is not a question. Yeah, they took on preventive measures before. As soon as they knew, and the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, announced that this is going to be a global pandemic in March, then they took measures, immediate measures to stop. In Italy they didn't, in Spain they didn't, in Britain they didn't. In the US actually President Trump was saying, oh, this is a flu, it's going to go away. Definitely. So it is a question of the structure of the health system and the speed at which the governments responded to this. When it comes to Africa, we're not going to go into lockdowns. We've seen it in Nigeria and South Africa, which has created violence, which has people cannot eat anything. In fact, a famous story in Kenya that came out of Kenya is the woman has 8 children. Her husband died because some gangsters killed him. What she used to do was she was cooking stones in her house, because the kids would see that some food is being cooked, so they would go to sleep without food. So it became viral, and now she's getting a lot of support from donors. But the problem is, in Africa, ILO has said this very clearly. We cannot have lockdowns in Africa. We have to have, of course, social distancing. We have to have the health system in place to be able to check on people who have the virus.
You mean the lockdown shouldn't be practical because majority of the nation live in a hand-and-mouth situation?
Yeah, this is a hand-to-mouth economy. If you take Ethiopia, for example, those people who buy and sell at the gullit are people who live literally on a daily basis. So if you lock them down, then the government has to be able to provide food. Now, even the United States, the biggest economy in the world, and the biggest producer of food in the world, is having problems to feed its population. The food banks are empty, even in the US. So I think in our country, what is important is the political authorities in Ethiopia, the government, opposition political parties, religious leaders, social organizations. We have social organizations in Ethiopia that have outlasted governments, like the Gada system, the Mahabars, the Idris, the Baitos. These are all legitimate organizations in community. You can use these organizations to be able to get the message directly to the people. So one way is, of course, I have seen it when I was in the United Nations, permanently working there. HIV/AIDS was a big problem. We knew HIV/AIDS was a serious problem after it killed village after village. The same thing now. I'm here as a trustee of Africa Humanitarian Action. We support about 22 million refugees and internally displaced people in Africa in this office. When Ebola came, we only found out after it killed 3,000 people in one village, literally in several villages.